Subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to get all the latest updates. One of the stories that should be getting a lot more attention, and oddly isn't, it's something that concerns all of us, the state of the economy. Especially for those of us who are salaried employees, this could be a dire time. The lockdown is slowly being lifted in cities across India, but hasn't fully been lifted. And as the Center for the Monitoring of the Indian Economy reveals, unemployment numbers are something to be very, very worried about. To make sense of this data, to tell us where we stand, we're joined now from Mumbai by Mahesh Vyas, who leads the center and who every month gives us a glimpse into what we should be concerned about and what we may feel slightly better about. Mahesh Vyas, thank you so much. It's a pleasure talking to you. Let me start by asking you, I've been wading through all of your numbers, and here's what someone who's not an economist, who doesn't understand the jargon, may not get. The numbers seem to suggest that in the middle, things got a bit better. Things got a bit better. There was somewhat of a recovery in the months of May and especially in June. But today we're once again looking at unemployment numbers that are at a 9-week high. And we're looking at about 1.8 crore, a little over that number, salaried people having lost their jobs since April. If you had to tell us the big picture of the jobs losses, what would you say?
The biggest story emerging from what we have learned so far is that there was a very quick recovery, surprisingly quick recovery from a very sharp fall in April. That partly deceived us into believing that we could be recovering faster than we had expected. But that's not true. And of course, we took that inference with a pinch of salt, even at that time. What we see now is that we have learned about the labor markets in this period. This is like a new learning for all of us, for me for sure.
Yeah.
Is that we all knew that the Indian labor markets are largely about informal jobs in unorganized sectors. Most jobs are vulnerable. Most jobs can be lost in the blink of an eye. So if there is a riot in a city somewhere, people working in that area lose their job for the day. This is very unlike a developed economy where if there's a riot or some unrest somewhere, you stay at home, but you still get your salary and you have a job to go back to. You're not unemployed till there's a lockdown. What we have seen in India is that the lockdown has impacted a huge labor force, and the moment we relaxed the lockdown, all of them came back to it.
Right.
So there was this great mobility in the informal jobs, in the unorganized sectors, that people can move in and out. But those are not the best jobs.
Mm-hmm.
The better jobs are the salaried jobs where you have a certain certainty about your job, where you can afford to take a few days off and you have some savings to fall back on. Those are taking a big hit, and that is where we are slipping and should be worried about.
I will ask you about the informal sector and the daily wages in particular, because I spent about the last few months actually tracking the movement of migrant workers across India. But I first want to focus on salaried employees. When I look at the CMIE data, it basically says the biggest hit to salaried jobs was in the month of April, when about 1.77 crore people who are salaried lost their jobs. Yet you have said that these numbers are ballooning. How do you explain that the biggest hit was in April, but after that, would you say the hit has been incremental? And if it has been incremental, why do you use the word ballooning?
So, yes, that's a very important question, and I think that requires an explanation. So, salaried jobs are not necessarily formalized jobs. You could have a salaried job which is still informal. So for example, maybe a chauffeur somewhere who's working informally is still a salary job. At the end of the month, the chauffeur does get a salary, or a housemaid. These are also salary jobs, but they're informal. These people took an immediate hit. And the rest, which were more regularized. When we talk about salary jobs, what this bring to our mind is somebody who goes to an office every day in the morning, picks up his bag, his lunchbox, takes the transport and goes out over there. Those guys are not the people who lost their jobs immediately. They took long. as the company started shutting down, as the company started laying off people, as the stress started playing out in companies, these people started losing their jobs. And this has emerged in a big way in the month of July.
Now, where do you see the biggest weaknesses? Which sectors? And some sectors are obvious, right? So there's aviation, there's hospitality, there's tourism. It's a no-brainer. But there are industries like mine, the media. I know many colleagues who've actually lost job. It's actually happening across the board, but we aren't seeing a whole lot of noise over it. Why do you think that is?
Why don't we see noise? I think Indians, I mean, this kind of perplexes me, but nevertheless, I will say that I've learned this in the past few years that I've been studying the labor markets.
Mm-hmm.
And the late finance minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, had remarked once saying that if there is so much unemployment, why is there no unrest on the streets? This is a complex question which requires an answer, and we don't have to wait for unrest to come. But it appears that the hit was in the past mostly taken by women, and women are less into quotes noisy when they lose their jobs. They kind of go back. Not that I am happy or agreeable with that, but that is what one observes, that they fall back because the men are still there working, and they can kind of find an equilibrium in that situation. The second thing is the bigger hit has come to the younger people. So who are the people who have lost the jobs? Almost the bulk of them are younger people and women. Younger people, men and women, taking the bulk. Now what happens over here is a 23, 24, 25-year-old young person steps out of his education, joins the labor market. Now imagine what happened. They joined this labor market in 2019 and lost the job in the pandemic.
Yeah.
Because they were still new.
Yeah.
They will be the ones who will suffer the most. So those people don't go and burn the streets. Those people are going to wait for another day. They're going to be patient. It's only when a lot of people lose their jobs and lose their hopes. Mind you, the unorganized sector did not lose their hopes.
Yes.
So we are seeing the stress of sustained salary jobs being lost for the first time probably. And we need to see how this plays out.
Let's talk a little bit about, I mean, I think you make this very important point that the salaried Indian is not necessarily an Indian employed in the formal sector. And therefore, we're not just talking about middle class and upper middle class Indians, we're also talking about lower income groups. Let's talk about daily wages now. We saw the single largest exodus of people during this lockdown, perhaps since the partition of India. Personally, I have tracked a number of men, women, and children to their villages, then gone to the villages to see what's happening, and even tracked the beginnings of the movement back to the cities. And that's also started to happen. But in both cases, whether in the village or whether in the city, there is no necessary return to the income they once had. And almost every single migrant worker I have met is in debt. And I think that the next big economic story is going to be one of debt, which maybe we're not paying attention to. What does your data tell you about daily wages, about people who may have found temporary employment in the villages, but that income no longer exists?
I think it's a very stressful story. There is loss of livelihood, there's loss of income, and there is necessarily an increase in indebtedness. And indebtedness starts off by borrowing from your ration shop provider. The provision store is where that debt increases, and we have noticed that in the data that debt source. So we look at why did you borrow and from whom did you borrow, and we see that the borrowing is largely for consumption purposes and largely from provision stores, and then it moves to friends and family, and I think it will play out to other sources. So there is an increase in indebtedness, which you rightly pointed out is going to be the next big problem. People will not be able to repay that. They will fall into further stress. There can be mental stress. There can be all kinds of problems, which is waiting to happen. So we have noticed, and across the board, a fall in incomes. So there is no one is spared, whether it is the rich people, the middle class people, or the poor people. Everyone has suffered a fall in income. but the lesser income people have suffered higher indebtedness as well, and largely from the informal sectors, particularly provision stores.
How do you explain the semblance of recovery in the month of June? What happened? There was obviously movement in the rural economy. There was obviously agricultural income to be made, but it seems to, going by your data, be strictly seasonal.
So yes, the big story is rural India, because Kharif sowing was very good. In June, we saw a 100% increase in Kharif sowing. And in June, we saw a 100% increase in Manrega percentage of people on the work. So that was a huge thing. And I think at the margin, there was some movement from urban to rural areas to take advantage of it. But it also had a spillover impact upon urban India, that some jobs kind of spill over. If there's an increase in Manrega jobs in the neighboring farmhouses in small towns, have a demand for their services to support that as well. It could be simple workshops, getting back the tools into place. It could be any kinds of supplies. This fertilizer and pesticide suppliers get active, agricultural implement tools, producers and traders get active. A whole lot of activity spills over into urban India. But besides that, mind you, a large part of urban India, particularly small towns, forget the Bombay, Bangalore, Chennai, partly Delhi story, but many of the others saw their shops open. Restaurants did not, but the shops did open. There was less footfall, but there was activity. So people were getting back to jobs even in urban India, particularly small town India.
Yeah. So here's what I want to ask you about Narega. The data seems to suggest that more wages or more resources under Narega have been consumed compared to the last 2019 and 2018. But what does this do to the rest of the year?
It's a big question. So as I understand it, the government has decided to prepone its spending, front load the spending. And that goes on till I think September or maybe October. It looks more like September. And they have also kind of spent at the cost of some ministries. So some ministries are spending more, some ministries are spending less. So I can extend your question into two. One is that the rest of the year looks really very bleak because we have overspent now. So the government finances are going to be less. But there may be less jobs as you go into the remaining part of the year. But let's say we'll solve that problem. But the front loading is clearly a very serious problem that I see in the remaining part of the year. There is also a problem with respect to if we have spent monies in some ministries and not in some ministries, we have solved a very narrow problem, but we have left the larger macroeconomic problem completely unaddressed. That means this government spending is directed and targeted and not towards increasing aggregate demand. So this will again improve maybe some supplies, but not demand. So if you do not increase aggregate spending, so there's no point in taking money from Education Ministry and putting it into Manrega. Because aggregate spending will go down, that will hurt us somewhere else. So you may solve this narrow problem over here, but you're probably causing a problem somewhere else. So I think this is a bigger problem. And the macroeconomy will see aggregate demand not growing. And you will see some ministries actually suffering because of this reallocation of resources.
So we've gone back to the old arguments that the government spending is the only thing that can, in a sense, create stimulus. You have ministers like Nitin Gadkari saying that we've got to just spend on infrastructure projects, that we have to inject energy into this dire or grim economic situation. Is that what you see happening up ahead? That the government is going to have to spend more?
Well, the government should spend. I don't see any solution. I don't see the corporate sector spending money in these times. If the corporate sector does not see demand in front of it, if it doesn't see people consuming goods, I see no reason why they should be investing. And mind you, the corporate sector has got a huge overhang of unutilized capacity. So if capacity utilization is less than 70%, they are not going to invest. If they don't invest, no jobs coming over there. So the only solution is for the government to spend, and the government needs to spend on two fronts. One is to spend on infrastructure. This is the time to build infrastructure and
Yeah.
investment in that. At the same time, also spend more directly to put money in the hands of people. Just put money in the hands of people as much as you can, because we're required to spur demand. Because if you do that, the corporate sector will follow to say money is going into the hands of people, we'll now invest. We require that.
So more in the direct cash benefits space.
That's right.
When you look at this data post the COVID lockdown and you compare it with unemployment data in past years, what are the significant differences that you sense? Because there's a sense that even pre-COVID, the economy structurally was not doing well. The lockdown has obviously hit it, and it's hit it with a full blow, which is why the worst numbers are in the month of April. But as India starts unlocking slowly, do you see sort of any pickup? And then post the pickup, how do you compare those numbers with, let's say, the last year?
So we need to understand that this lockdown is just one very unfortunate and very sudden, very severe hit that we got. But even if we did not get this, we were going down. So 2019-20 is full of bad results. So 2019-20, every quarter of this financial year, forget the GDP calculations, but you look at the company financials.
Mm-hmm.
Companies' financials. This is based on individual companies announcing their results. No, not possible to fudge accounts too much away.
Yeah.
You see, year-on-year comparison, every quarter was negative. 4 consecutive quarters of negative top-line growth.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the same one had negative real value-added growth, which means the Indian corporate sector was in a deep recession in 2019-20 before it got hit by this lockdown. So even if the lockdown is lifted and we go back to work as normal, we're going to go back to a recession.
Yeah.
So we require something really very strong to come out of this and get out of the older problem we had, which was recession.
There is the dissonance of the stock markets. And I mean, I know all the explanations that there are only a handful of companies that drive the Sensex, but it is almost like an economic bubble. You know, if you had to look at what's happening on the markets and then the giant companies that continue to increase their share value, then there is also this interesting data that is now available and how many of these big corporate companies have actually reduced spending on employees to actually rationalize their costs, but their shares continue to do well. How do we see the dissonance in terms of how the markets are doing with how you read the macroeconomics today?
Well, the dissonance is best seen in the following fashion. In the past, we said that if the stock markets are getting better, if valuations are getting better, if the returns are turning out to be increasingly better, it is a sign that the economy is improving.
Yeah.
Or the turnaround, whichever way this is.
Yeah.
I think that connect is lost. That connect doesn't hold anymore. So if the stock markets are doing well, it does not necessarily mean now that the economy is going to improve tomorrow. So let's forget that part. Now, then if you forget that part, then you can explain the rest, like you have already explained, that there are a handful of stocks and there is a lot of liquidity that people have got. So they are going to put money over here because they're going to see some returns and there's no other place to put the money in. So you can't put the money into real estate. Interest rates are going down, so debt markets are no good. So you're only left with equity markets, a few stocks over there, and gold. So gold is rising and equity markets are rising. It's a very narrow market. The bubble will become unmanageable. There'll be some bubble bursts which will come back every time the interest rates are reduced. You're only going to increase the stock markets going up. It's not helping the real economy because there's no demand.
Where are your alarm bells ringing? I mean, I know they're ringing in terms of job losses, but specifically, if I had to ask you, what's really worrying you right now, what would it be?
I think the lack of attention that the government has towards reviving the economy. That worries me now. I didn't worry so much about it for too long, and I'm not a policy prescription person.
Sure.
But as a monitor of the Indian economy, as tracking what is happening to them, what will bring it back to an even keel? Where will
Yeah.
the recovery come from? I don't see the corporate sector doing that, because they will run only on the incentive structures in front of them.
Yeah.
Only if they see profits or demand growing, or they will take a risk and go and build up new capacities. So they're not going to do anything.
Yeah.
Then you have the households. Are the households going to be risk-taking, that let's go buy a new house, let's go buy a new car, let's go and do something fancy today? No. They are going to be extremely risk-averse. In the last 4 years, they have seen 3 hits. So they have seen the demonetization hit, they have seen GST take away many of their jobs and businesses, and now you have this bigger hit, the pandemic, which is a problem on a health front, fears with respect to health, fear that the health systems in India are not adequate and don't look like they're going to remain adequate. So there's great fear over there, and you've got a livelihood. So it's not going to be the people of India, it's not going to be the corporate. Then it has to necessarily be the government. And the government is not applying its full attention into saying, if the liquidity program for the MSME did not work, let's do something else and let's fix the problem. Let's do something to get this economy. So a larger scale discussion and debate, bringing on board people who can probably help us think more broadly on how to solve the economy's problem. I think that's what worries me.
Finally, the government will have to confront the full consequence of the lockdown and whether it was a wise move. You've had the individual corporate leader like a Rajiv Bajaj, for example, saying this is not flattened the curve of the coronavirus, it's actually flattened the GDP. And I asked you this because the numbers, the serological survey numbers, and I know you're not a medical expert, but I'm going to ask a question related to your sector. The serological surveys actually pretty much point to the fact that the infection is way more widespread than we thought, but the recovery is also much better than we thought. The fatality rate is lower. In other words, we could be looking at herd immunity, the beginnings of herd immunity. We are definitely looking at community transmission, which actually makes the point that the lockdown had a very, very limited effect in terms of helping containing this virus. Where we stand today, if India does not unlock swiftly, how much worse do you think we're going to look at in terms of the state of the economy? And how would you describe the state of the economy?
If we do not, I'll have to kind of be careful with my words over here. So I'm using a word that's phrase which is going to be difficult to explain out, but let me use it. If we don't lift this lockdown today, the economic consequences are going to be disastrous. They were disastrous to begin with. But let me qualify what do I mean by lifting the lockdown. It doesn't mean, start off everything. Yeah. That's not it. And that was not what was supposed to happen even in April. So I think the epidemiologists seem to have captured the entire thinking of the government. Yeah. There was a need for a more broader consultation as to what is the implication of this and what is the preparation we require to deal with this. So look at the loss of livelihoods, and as we are trying to contain the pandemic, it's also important to say what measures can we take to reduce the pain of those people who are losing their livelihoods, who will fall in debt tomorrow, who may remain in debt for a very long, for this entire lifespan of theirs. What do we do with that? The lack of attention towards the economics of the lockdown is where we went wrong. So I think we should raise the lockdown, we should lift the lockdown, but we should do it carefully. We should do it because it is important to worry about the effects of loss of livelihoods.
Yeah, I will share in the end with you the number of poor Indian citizens who said to me that poverty will kill us before the virus does. And the panic that induced, I do think has just not got enough of the attention it should have. Hopefully the data that you put out, which is empirical and not normative, as journalist stories can be dismissed, will get the attention that it should. Mahesh Vyas, pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.